Hello, everybody. It is your friend Riley from Los Angeles, and today I have with me your friend Roby from Los Angeles. Woo!
Hello.
Roby has a master's in dramaturgy, and he is a dramaturg turned experiential theater practitioner. And we're going to explain to you what all those words mean, because I did not know until I talked with Roby about them. I'm really excited to talk with Roby today because I think, so as part of getting the master's, he had to publish a thesis, and the thesis is very much about consent in immersive theater, and I think that it actually has a lot that comedians especially, as we kind of navigate this question, which for some reason is new, and it shouldn't be, of like, well, what if I make my audience mad? And it's like, we always should have been worried about that. But now I think that audience relationship and making sure that and encouraging that consensual, like, back and forth is something that comedians can learn from immersive theater practice. So really excited to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Roby.
Of course. I'm super excited to talk about all the ways in which audiences can have agency and be respected.
Yay! Isn't that nice? Isn't that something we should be concerned with as performers? Anyway, we'll get on our soapboxes a little bit more later. But first, I just want to start with just laying down some base terms. What is dramaturgy? Saying just completely for a lay person, never heard the word dramaturg. What does that person do?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a common problem. Not a lot of people know what dramaturgy is.
Yeah.
Even dramaturgs don't really know what dramaturgy is. But the gist is essentially that a dramaturg is sort of like a research consultant that works on a play. So for every play, for every script, there's an entire history and cultural background with regard not only to the play itself and who authored it and why it was penned in the first place, but also maybe with what happens in the play itself, what kind of cultural forces are at play, what time period it takes place in, what that would look like being transferred onto the stage. Even for plays that decide to play around with time period, or a director decides to make a choice to shift something into a different era or somehow change the dynamics, a dramaturg can be immensely helpful in not only providing all of the cultural context and significance that the script had in the first place, but also what moving that text into a different context would do for the show. And so, for example, if I'm working on a period play, I can help actors with the mannerisms that they might have for a particular time period, especially if we're going for a sense of realism. Or on the flip side, for something that's a little bit more absurdist and very forward, instead, I can focus on the philosophies that underpin that kind of new take on drama. And so in that case, it'd be a little bit less about me helping the actors with their actions and helping them understand the significance of this kind of boundary and genre breaking play in the first place. So I just consult.
Yeah.
I can.
I think, and that's awesome, and I could see why that, especially as a comedian, having the context behind a character in a performance really helps you understand the layers of what you're saying. So much of comedy is those different layers, and context is necessary for your setups, your punchlines. So
exactly, and that way the director can focus on more of the creative choices, and I can give the director the info that he needs to make those creative choices.
That's cool. So what is, and dare I ask, what is immersive theater for someone who's never heard that term before? How would you try to
Absolutely. So I think there are two keys here. First is what the heck is the psychological state of immersion, which we could,
Right.
I could go on about, but cutting to the chase with immersive theater itself, it's a newer genre of theater that's really been pioneered within the last decade or so. It's primarily come out of the United Kingdom, and it's been popular there for around a decade before moving across the world in the last few years, especially the US. Essentially, immersive theater is different from regular theater in that it seeks to give audiences agency, to give them choice, to allow them to interact and experiment, even possibly change the play that traditional theater has never allowed. So a lot of immersive theater can almost be akin to being in a video game of some sort. Like you're suddenly allowed to interact with the actors and have conversations with them, or you're allowed to touch the set or manipulate objects. You're able to walk around. You can form your own experience. And this is where immersive theater is very much related to this new kind of experience economy, where it's all about forming this unique experience for yourself, and that's unique as a product in an artistic journey versus consuming the same kind of straightforward play that everybody else is going to. Immersive theater is kind of hard to define because it can take many different forms. There's not a lot of consensus out there, and a lot of immersive theater people sometimes actually argue against trying to define the genre, because it's just this whole wing of experimental theater that's can sometimes feel completely unrelated to each other. So it's
Right.
a hard question to ask, but basically the very roots of it is that as an audience member in immersive theater,
Hmm.
you get to do a lot more. And you actually get to interact with the play in ways that have never been allowed in the past. You're not passive, you're active.
Interesting. Yeah, because if you walk on stage during a normal show and try to touch an actor's prop, you're probably going to get kicked out.
Exactly.
So that's in my head, that is the primary difference. I can touch the stuff that the actors are touching for the most part, and we'll get for the most part. So my next question, to kind of give an idea of some examples of some immersive theater productions. What was your first immersive experience as a player, or as the
Absolutely.
audience?
Yeah, that's very important because prior to my first experience, I didn't even know immersive theater was a thing. And so it's very mind blowing to go through that, and realize something like that's even possible. My first experience was at a production in Houston called The Man from Beyond. It's one of the few immersive theater practices going on in Houston. It's by a company called Strange Bird Immersive. And what they've done is that they've combined a piece of immersive theater with an escape room. And so part of the experience is an escape room, but they've created this immersive theater mold around it, so that there's a story, there's interactivity, there's really cool characters and actors that you can interact with. And I had experienced that being an escape room enthusiast first. And so that's how I got into this experience. And it's really an amazing production. It's based on going to a seance for the late magician Harry Houdini.
Ooh.
And you're essentially tasked with appeasing this supernatural force as you go throughout the experience. And there's a great Madam Fortune Teller involved. And I don't want to spoil too much, but it takes some really cool twists and
It's
turns,
still
and
running.
it's
It's
really
something that
intimate.
people can go see. Is it? It's still.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, cool.
exactly. It is still going on.
Nice.
Unfortunately, with the pandemic,
Ah,
things are a little on hold. but they had just moved to a new facility last summer and finally opened up. And yeah, they're in it for the long haul. The company's also creating some other experiences right now. And I know online they've actually, during quarantine, they've been doing like a tarot reading. Um,
Cool.
Tarot is one of like the activities that the fortune teller
Ooh.
actress kind of uses to slide you into the immersive theater experience. And she has to be really talented to do that. She's improvising based on people, like a lot of fortune tellers do.
Cool.
So they've managed to translate that part of the experience online, at least.
That's so cool. Yeah, I definitely feel like it could be a whole nother talk about the way that theaters are transferring their stuff to the
Yes.
internet right now. But that's it's cool. So you mentioned escape rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed in your paper you kind of talk about escape rooms, haunted houses, some of these thrilling experiences. It being in kind of the same vein as immersive theater, but it sounds like with that experience, you say that like an escape room, the boundaries between an escape room and immersive theater are not like hard, but a
Mm-hmm.
production like that adds this element of an actress and a plot, even more of a plot line than you get in the escape room.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's really cool. So, and you said that the having the actress there with you and the way that they did it added a layer of intimacy in the production, which is cool. So, how did that differ from your experiences with escape rooms? What was the difference for you?
Absolutely. So first thing with like escape room, even like the most lavishly decorated and filled out escape rooms, generally it's a very simple story plot.
Mm-hmm.
Very few escape rooms I've come across have actually had like dramatic elements, like interactive videos or game masters that were characters in the experience. They're out
Okay.
there. They're out
Yeah.
there, but escape rooms are of course way more focused on the game rather than
Yeah.
the narrative and dramatic unfolding of a plot. Like that's just like an added bonus. For immersive theater, of course, we're really about like the story, but we have the other elements as well. So
Right.
having an actress in The Man from Beyond is really interesting because she's in character the whole time. She's in that space and there's an intimacy because you're in a small group of people interacting with her and you're interacting with her directly. And I think that that kind of throws new people off because you've never really been taught or had to interact with any kind of actor before. If you've
Right.
seen any kind of performance, like, I mean, I think, improv comedians can maybe, or improv fans can kind of relate if they happen to get pulled up on stage for
Right.
something,
And
but
no one ever
otherwise,
wants that. It sounds like
yeah,
immersive theater is like, now you're going to do that and that's it, that is the experience.
yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, it's very intimate already because here you are acting with a complete stranger, and
Yeah.
that's what the experience is. And so, in particular, with this fortune teller, it's really fun because she's having to intuit so many things about you
Mm-hmm.
and try to get you just completely involved in this story world where you're about to have a seance to try to communicate with the spirit of Harry Houdini. And of
Yeah.
course, there's more layers than that. Things go wrong.
Right.
She maybe breaks character a bit, and maybe she wasn't the
That's
maybe
cool.
she's a quack. There's things that happen throughout the plot of the show that make her really interesting, and so she feels like a fleshed out person, especially because you're having actual conversation with her.
So
So
cool.
it's, yeah, really, it's very intimate in that, there can be touch. You're talking with someone face to face, you're moving in close quarters. These immersive theater actors are often guiding you or somehow facilitating the action in the
Right.
space. So it's a little bit of a teamwork effort, and you having to deal with another person versus, in traditional theater, you're just kind of sitting down in a seat and you're watching
Right.
something. You're not having to actively communicate with someone.
Yeah, you're creating the experience as player along with this actor, and this actor now has to navigate and handle like 5 different layers of reality. There's
Yeah.
like which I think is really cool and interesting, like all the different layers of fiction and fact that you could play within it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And that's where, like, you know, especially improvisation is
yeah,
so important because these actors have to work with people. And as often as like a player in these experiences, you're allowed to ask them questions. You're
yeah.
absolutely allowed to try to engage them in conversation, and they have to be
Yeah,
ready
they gotta do it.
to riff back to you in character.
That's so cool. So what was the first thing that you did behind the scenes? What was the first thing that you worked on for immersive theater?
Of course, that would have been, I was working as a PA on Safe House 82, which is an
Mm.
immersive theater production that's out here in LA. And it was really interesting because I found that immersive theater, or at least the environments I've been in so far, have been very hands-on, very collaborative. And
Mm.
so even though they brought me on as a production assistant, they really let me help develop a lot of the show once they found out that I had this expertise and this background in dramaturgy. And that was a really interesting show to work on, not only because we were kind of writing it as we were rehearsing it, but
Mm.
also because it was very complex as a piece of immersive theater.
Mm.
Safe House 82 is a spy thriller that deals with an audience of about a dozen people a night. You arrive as an audience member on the premise that you're a CIA agent in the 80s that has been summoned by this greater, higher up spy,
Mhm.
and you don't know why, but you're meeting at this old safe house because it's a sequel. Um, and you find out that the CIA has been committing these atrocities, especially in Africa, by peddling
Which
weapons,
are real, right? The things
which are
that
real life. Yeah, there's
yeah,
real
there's
life
no
things that
joke
happen.
here. You
We
guys
just
are
made a
actually
fictional
talking
story
about
off of
yeah.
facts. Yeah. Um, and, as an audience member, you're given a lot of leeway to and how you interact and even change the show. And so, first of all, the show can be kind of like a party atmosphere. We have snacks, we have drinks, we have cocktails, and it's totally fine in that show if you just want to sit back, drink some alcohol,
Right.
and just talk with people or party. That's totally fine. We also had a cast of amazing actors who could improvise with you. There were scripted scenes, of course, and of course there's like a scripted plot, but we had plenty of wiggle room for those improvised moments. And
Mm.
so as an audience member, you could really talk to these characters, learn more about them, and even if you actually invest in that, you could actually unlock some dialogue options or like secret puzzles that you could end up working on. And that brings me into the puzzles too. We also took a lot of inspiration from escape rooms. And so, as part of the experience, the audience would solve puzzles in order to rack up evidence against the CIA. The premise there being that there was a previous spy who had collected the evidence but was assassinated and had hidden the evidence around the house before she knew she was going to be killed. So, there's a lot there. There's a
Yeah.
lot of potential for interactivity. And on top of all of that, depending on how well you solved the puzzles and how well you interacted with the actors, you could actually change the outcome of the story. We had 3 different endings: a bad ending, a good ending, and the best ending. And depending on the choices that you made as an audience, and
Wow.
the directions that you went and things that you found, that would lead to different outcomes. So yeah, it's very cool in that way because you actually feel like you're having an impact on the whole
Yeah.
production as an audience member.
Your choices have consequences. Well, not only is it like fun puzzle solving, but like you actually make it's edutainment about some horrible CIA bullshit, and you have an impact and have to make your decision about, do I figure this out? Do I keep my mouth shut? It's very
Exactly.
interesting to play through such a big moral dilemma in like a fun way.
Yeah. And plus, like, the whole point of that show as well was to be somewhat flexible. Like,
Yeah.
you don't have to solve puzzles. You don't have to
No.
talk to the actors. You don't have to have snacks or drinks. Of course, you're paying, so we hope that you do,
Right. Maybe
because
do
you
something.
paid a ticket. But we're not forcing you to engage
Right.
in these ways. Like, we're very much that production is very mindful of its audience agency,
Yeah.
because we want people to do what feels best to them, just to have a fun time and go along for the ride.
Yeah. So what about immersive drew you to it? We touched on it a little bit, but if you could just a quick summary of like what are the elements of it that really pull you towards this form, this genre?
Totally. A few things come to mind first, so I'll just like rattle them
Yeah.
quickly. Um, First, I like the fact that immersive theater is such a huge departure from traditional theater, especially in the way that I think it can be more accessible to a lot of people because it's shedding a lot of the white-coated elitist theater
Mm-hmm.
spaces that performances often take place in.
Right.
It's allowing for interactivity and it wants audience reaction. So it's not conforming to Eurocentric mannerisms of like sit down, shut up, watch this thing for 3 hours
Listen
straight
to what
without moving.
the authority is telling you in this
Exactly.
big
It's
theater.
allowing, kind of going off that point, it's allowing for deeper audience engagement. I'm a huge video gamer and I love escape rooms as well. And something I've always just incredibly appreciated is being immersed into these new worlds, being able to interact with them, touch
Yeah.
them, move around them, see things, explore new things, and kind of form my own journey. Even if it's like scripted, like you still feel like you're creating your own experience
Yeah.
because you're the one navigating throughout that environment. So
Right.
the way in which you do that is completely unique to you, and you may have a completely different play style or way of interacting than from a close friend. Um, I also like the fact that immersive theater, at least where it is currently, seems a lot more collaborative and an all hands in effort. The key with immersive theater is that it's inherently interdisciplinary. One of the reasons why it's really caught on in Los Angeles as compared to other parts of the US is because Los Angeles has screenwriters, theme park designers. It forever had an amazing immersive haunted house scene. It has the escape rooms. It has all these creative people from different backgrounds, often who aren't coming from theater, and who are engaging in creating these immersive theater pieces because it's inherently involving different genres and different medias and different forms. Several immersive creators I know have taken a huge amount of inspiration from like recent indie video games, often called like the walking simulators, where you're
Yeah.
kind of unfolding this plot as like you discover artifacts like Firewatch or Gone Home or Tacoma,
Mhm.
things like that. So that's something that was very, very attractive. And then, I mean, the last thing is that, there are so many different ways to do immersive theater. You can have the escape room elements, you don't have to. You can have the interactive actors, you don't have to. You can do an immersive show just by giving someone a pair of headphones, a recorded narrative, and let them walk across the city as this narrative that they're hearing paints a completely new story on top of this existing landscape. That's valid as well. Immersive theater can involve different art forms like sound art, dancing, visual art as well. There's just there's so much you can do with it. There's more opportunities and less limits. Whereas I feel like traditional theater can often feel the opposite. Like there's like a lot of limits and
Yeah.
there's less experimenting that you can do.
Oh yeah. If you ever talk to people out here who are actors and who are auditioning for things, they know exactly what they can audition for, they know exactly where, and they know exactly what that experience is going to be like. And it's like it almost starts to feel like, you know, factory workers if you know
Yeah.
actors in Los Angeles. So I could see why immersive practitioners are like, stop trying to define us. We
Yeah.
are, which brings me to my next question. You had to define things in order to write a thesis about it. What were the challenges of conducting this academic level research in such a new field, and in one that almost defies classification on
Yeah.
purpose?
So the challenges were that I had to start at like ground zero. No one in my department, at least save for one person, I didn't even find out till I left my program that they knew anything about it. No one in my department knew anything about it. Like I was completely on my own. It was brand new. Immersive theater is catching on, but it's still such a new genre to everywhere that's not the UK that so many people just don't know about it. So I had to educate myself. Um, Part of the challenge too is that most of the scholarship is from the UK. And that means that scholarship is behind unique barriers, which may not be apparent at first. Another thing as well is that, you know, understanding what immersive theater is, especially if it's theater that has immersion as a goal, means knowing what immersion is in the first place. I had already been accustomed to hearing about immersion because I'm a gamer, because I'm like a nerd that way. And so like that as a concept, I wasn't totally new to that, but a lot of people are. And I still had to go through the weeds in trying to figure out what immersion means, because immersion was very much pioneered by game studies and by people in the sciences studying technology. And so all of that discourse has only happened within the last few decades. And if we know anything about like recent postmodernist scholarship, is that things are crazy. Things are flying in and out the window all the time. New definitions are being given. I had to go through all this scholarship just to find the studies that then pointed and said, okay, no, all of this is wrong, all of this is wrong. There's no evidence that these are different phenomena. Like, this is what this thing is. There's a lot of, there's like a lot of concepts that are interrelated that may or may not actually exist. Like, it's mind-blowing. And the same thing goes for immersive theater too, as a genre. Like, same thing. People don't really know what's in it, what's out of it, what the core of it is. It's all so new. And so that's why, like, my introduction section that covers the definition of immersion and the definition of immersive theater ends up being like 54 pages because there's just so much ground you have to cover, and you have to cover all these definitions just to say that's what people used to think, and now we're here.
And you couldn't take anything for granted. One thing that I noticed in your thesis is you even had to come up with a term that fit for the audience, the player, the person who buys the ticket. You called it role to player, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the different roles that you would say exist in an immersive theater production, and then specifically, what does that role to player mean? How did you land on that phrase?
Yes. So there's been a lot of audience ontologies, as in like things that you can call audiences that kind of position them uniquely. There's been a lot of different audience ontologies that practitioners have come up with, like calling their immersive audiences like guests, like we are the host, you are the guest, we are treating you, we're also guiding you. There's like active participants, like they're stressing the activeness of the audience taking a role in a production. There's interactors, like they want that interactive element. The problem that I saw with so many of these definitions is that they worked for each of these practitioners and their particular practices, but they did not work across the genre as a whole. And that's understandable because, like I've been saying, immersive theater is an inherently amorphous, interdisciplinary genre. And so what I did was come up with the ontology of the role to player to be a more standardized term, not only that can have us thinking about all of the possible planes in which an audience member may or may not interact with an immersive theater production, but also, again, to standardize our language around immersive theater audiences, because when we all use different terms, we all can mean completely different things. And that can make it really hard to have a good dialogue and discussion about what it means to be an immersive theater. So role to player, I coined it for 6 reasons, the specifically role to player, what that means. So the first is the idea of the audience having a role. They have a role within the production, something that is given to them, something that they are putting on, they are acting out.
Right.
A player can mean both someone who engages in a sport or game. It can also mean, it's an old-fashioned word for an actor. And so player was important to me because it's someone who is specifically interacting with the production. There's an interactive element there, which all immersive theater should have in some way. Even if it's minimal, there should be an interaction that's happening. There's role player. Role playing being different from having a normal role, in that role playing has an element of improvisation. It's not entirely scripted. In any kind of like LARP or role playing game, you have developed a persona, but you're often improvising based on the context that you're in that character. And often immersive theater audiences can find themselves role playing in similar ways in similar situations. Doesn't have to be the case, but certainly can be. The fourth reason, a role to play. Immersive theater often gives its audiences agency because they want them to make choices that affect the outcome of the production or help change or shape the production in some way. And so you have a role to play in service of the production. You're inherently important to the success of that show. And then number 5, role to player, as in you can shift between those states. You can shift from having a role or just enacting a role to suddenly being a player, kind of like the experience I mentioned earlier where there was like an escape room portion, right? Like the story was still there, but you kind of shifted from a more narrative, interactive based thing to a gamey portion. And then the last one being that you can shift back and forth. You can be everything from a role to a player. You can encompass those things at the same time. So you can be a range of those identities all at once. And so I felt like those 6 tenets really helped show everything that an immersive audience can be in a production. All productions are going to have their own limits, own limitations. Some areas are going to have more opportunity than others depending on each show. But if this is about possibilities and everything that the immersive audience can do,
Right.
then this at very least gives us a way to delineate
Yeah.
what they can be and allow us to clearly articulate where they stand, where they're positioned in the context of the show. That's why this is often called audience positioning.
Yeah.
Like, what relation do they have to the production?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I like the idea of it being that spectrum, because as long as you are either playing a role, you're actively getting into a role, or you are playing the game of what's happening, then you're still like engaging with that experience, even if it's left up to you to go back and forth between it. But that term would not apply to sitting in an audience watching a traditional show.
Exactly.
Is that
It's really
that
about stressing the agency. And
yeah.
it's a whole other conversation. There is something to be said for like an audience that's sitting there
Right.
and their active attendance to what's happening in front of them.
Yeah.
But in immersive theater in particular, the ways that you can interact and the opportunities are just so much greater than traditional theater. And that's one of the clear, dare I say, clear lines between old theater and this theater.
Say, there's so many things that we talked about where I'm like, dare I say this attempt at a definition. But speaking of audience, that is what I want to talk about in part 2 of this interview. I think that this has been a great primer of like, what is this thing that we're talking about, and what does it mean, and what are some examples, and what are the aspects of it. And now I would like to talk more about audiences and the focus of your thesis, which was all about audience consent, and how do you turn that into a positive thing rather than considering it a block.
Mm-hmm.